Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Podcast Daily. It is Tuesday. Ohio State is about to be back on the practice field for spring practice number 3. That's Bill Landis, and I'm Austin Ward. We will both be there, and we'll hear from Ryan Day later on this morning. But until then, we're going to do a little math. Maybe. That's not really the strength of this show. Last week, Ohio State confirmed and released to anyone who wanted it all of the Ohio State coaching staff's updated contract information, whether they got new deals, whether they got raises, whether it was an entirely new thing. We got our hands on that. And we talked about it on ohiostate.rivals.com. You can join there right now for free if you want with a code DTE30. And the conversation was robust, more so than maybe I thought it would be, because we didn't think about talking about it on the Podcast Daily last week. And you were like, you know what? We probably should do that. There were a lot of people with questions. So I'll ask you, what was the first thing that you thought when we got our hands on that?
Yeah, welcome to Pocket Watching on the podcast. There were a couple things. I think maybe most generally the amount that Ohio State's assistant pool has grown in the last this is Ryan Day's 5th year, right? If I'm not mistaken, going into his 5th season.
That's right.
It is $2 million more than it was when he started, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot of money to people. I think it is a lot of money in the context of we're talking about a program that was so reticent to pay assistant coaches $1 million, and now they have $5 million assistants. And last year they led the country in assistant coaches pay. I assume that if they don't lead it again this year, they'll be right up there near the top with over $9 million paid out to its assistant coaches. So that's kind of where I started. The idea that Ohio State has suddenly become so aggressive in that space when arguably they were lagging behind for such a long time relative to the other power programs in the sport, I think is an interesting position to find them in at this moment.
Yeah, I've used that as one example out of a handful that I know that there are fair criticisms to be made of Gene Smith and the athletic department, and we've pointed those out over time. But it also has to be said that Ohio State has shown a willingness to adjust its approach, whether that's financial or otherwise, but in this case, related specifically to paychecks. As you said, Greg Schiano really broke through that door at the $1 million mark as a coordinator, and it was treated as this massive deal. And now you have a cornerbacks coach in Tim Walton at that same level. That's not a game that Ohio State wanted to play a decade ago, and Gene Smith was reticent about participating in the arms race, and that meant facilities, and that meant coaching salaries and upgrades to the horseshoe and everything. And it's done all of that now, and you can see the value of that consistency with the staff from the perspective that there are not guys leaving for lateral jobs, not without promotions, and certainly not without massive pay grades. I think something somebody asked about Corey Dennis was well, this amount of money, seems like he would want to leap for somewhere else. And I looked around. So, well, okay, where's he going to go? He's, compared to other quarterbacks coaches, not paid as well as some others on Ohio State's staff relative to their position, but he makes double or even triple what a MAC offensive coordinator makes. So is that a position, or a job that he wants to leap at? If he truly thought that would advance his career more so than being a quarterback's coach at Ohio State, then you'd have to give up that amount of money to do that and pursue that path. So Ohio State's made it, and Gene Smith has helped make it where coaches do not have to look around to either advance their career or their bank account.
And that's good, I suppose. I don't get too up in arms about the money that's thrown around in college football, because you're just screaming into the void. Of course, there's a lot of it. I wish the players got more of it. There's not really much I can do about that. So if Ohio State is expected to be competitive, then this is one of the ways they have to do that. My question then is, you have the largest assistant coaching salary pool in the country. Are you getting the most out of it? And I don't know that they are. And the idea that I don't sound like picking on one guy, and I don't mean it to, but what exactly has Tim Walton done to become $1 million quarterback coach? And I don't have it in front of me. I don't have access to the USA Today salary pool to see if there are other position coaches who really aren't coordinators making that kind of money. I'm sure there are. How many? I'm not entirely sure. But if you're paying $1 million to someone to coach the cornerbacks, then they better be the best quarterback coach in the country, or in that conversation. And maybe someday Tim Walton will be. I don't think he is just yet. There's probably some projection baked into that you think he will get to that point, and that's all well and good. But that's like if thought one is, boy, Ohio State has really upped the ante with how it's willing to pay assistant coaches, then thought two is there has to be a result from that, and that it's coincided with them like taking a step behind Michigan, and they haven't won a national championship since 2014. I don't know, like those two things don't add up to me. I feel like one should go hand in hand with the other, and at the moment it's not.
Yeah, I think Tim Walton found himself in a situation with a lot of leverage in that you can look at last season and we can talk about the injuries that that group was dealt with and the inexperience and the low scholarship numbers, why it may not have performed like the best group of cornerbacks in the country. And I think that that is certainly fair to point out. And I also think it's fair for people to question that and say, well, how do you get that level of raise coming off of that 1 year if the results didn't quite match that? Well, there, in Tim Walton's case, and some of this I'm going to be assuming, but we heard that there were teams at the NFL level that would be a landing spot if he wanted to go back there after 1 year. If he didn't like recruiting, if he didn't like the grind of college coaching, you know, he was going to have that in his hip pocket. And then the concern there, the secondary concern for that Ohio State would be then yet again trying to replace a cornerbacks coach, which that's become the defense against the dark arts position for Ohio State and the Woody, just a revolving door. And that's not good for the cornerbacks. You're asking about, you know, outside of the program, where's the development? What's the fundamentals? Like if then every new guy is teaching something different and you have that go on for 5, 6, 7 years in a row, like you're not going to get any better at what the other people are teaching you if you have to go back and learn another new technique. And I'm not saying that it's that complicated, that everybody teaches cornerbacks a different way, but that is a notable change for people that are trying to develop at that position. So Ohio State was fighting against two of those things, and Tim Walton had a lot of leverage. I don't know that he used it, but I would suspect if you got $1 million contract out of it, you probably did.
Yeah, it was a $300,000 raise, which is like that's a lot of money for coming off of a guy who's, you know, does not have a super long track record of being one of the top college coaches. Now, like he does have like prior coordinator experience. I know, and Cleveland.com reported that he got a passing game coordinator title. That is not in his contract. It just says assistant head coach or assistant football coach. But they did toss him a fancy coordinator title. Ohio State has a lot of those going around. A lot. I do agree with you that like I understand like paying for continuity, and they have not, that position in particular, cornerback, has probably been the most impacted by a lack of continuity, more impacted than any other position, right? So since 2017, it's been like it was Kerry Combs in 17, then he left, then it was Tabor Johnson in 18, then it was Jeff Hafley in 19, and then Kerry Combs came back for 20 and 21, and now it's Tim Walton. Like that's a lot of turnover at one position.
Mm-hmm.
And Kerry Combs at the time too was like trying to be a coordinator. I don't even know how like actually hands-on he was with the cornerbacks. So if you're paying for stability, I get that. And also too, like these players seem to really like Tim Walton. I know, I mean, I personally, I think a lot of fans didn't feel like they saw a ton of results at that position. And for long stretches of the year, it felt like the vulnerable point of the defense. But I do think there is something to be said for how coaches or players seem to respond to coaches, and to a man, all these cornerbacks seem to really like him. He did okay in recruiting. I wouldn't give him an A in recruiting in his first cycle, but Jermaine Matthews and Calvin Simpson-Hunt's a pretty good 2-man class, but they lost 2 commits too. So I don't know. It's just odd to me. Like that was not the season where you come off like, oh yeah, $300K, no problem. Let's give it to him. And it's not that like I don't care personally what Tim Walton makes. Like good for him. Like he got the bag. Congratulations. It's just a matter of when you are willing to allocate resources in the way that Ohio State is, are you maximizing them? And sometimes with these like the Tim Walton thing, like bringing back Parker Fleming on a 2-year deal and giving him a raise to $500,000 a year after frankly a bad year on special teams. Like I don't get that one either. So it's not the amounts of money that are being thrown around. It's like sort of, I don't know, the results that don't quite match up with that money, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably, based on the feedback we've received. We had already, a month ago or so, we reported and said that Parker Fleming was getting a new deal, that it was going to be $500,000. We talked about that then, and I don't know that we have anything different to add to it, but that's certainly been the one that has drawn the most amount of ire from the fan base, who's looking at that and doing the back of the napkin calculations. Like, this guy's in charge of special teams, and he's occasionally, pitching in with the defensive backs, and they can't execute a fake in the rivalry game. They thought that they did and fixed it in the Peach Bowl. It would have been or should have been called back for a penalty with or without the timeout. You miss a key field goal, you don't execute as well as you want in the kickoff game, or you still don't have a punt return or a kickoff back for a touchdown. You're like, well, how are you getting $500,000 worth of value out of that? And I don't know the answer. I also don't have to decide how much everyone should make and how much Ohio State is willing to put into that overall kitty. But as you're saying, when you're looking and comparing this position, that position, experience, tenure, whatever else, recruiting success, some of these are a little bit hard to figure out in your brain.
Yeah, I don't like Perry Eliano is making like half of what Tim Walton makes, which is odd to me. It's also, on a side note, odd to me that Perry Eliano is not Ohio State's cornerbacks coach. But I tried to address that with Ryan Day when he made those hires, and he didn't really answer the question. So I guess that's just how things are.
Well, what's Sauce Gardner doing at the next level? I mean,
yeah, right. Yeah, he wasn't awesome or anything like that. And he has a how many position coaches here have coached individual award winners at their respective position? Because I know Perry Eliano has, or at least the position he used to coach. I don't know. That's like an odd number to me too. Like Keenan Bailey is like making like the standard like first year assistant coach, like whatever. I don't really have any issue with that. I thought Justin Fry getting a bump to $1 million was interesting. He was hired at 800,000, so it wasn't as large of a bump for him as it was for Tim Walton. And Justin's got like a new run game coordinator title. He was like, what was he, associate head coach for offense last year?
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's not that now. He's the run game coordinator. We'll spin the wheel and see what he is next year, I guess. But that's another guy,
Indiana head coach.
Yeah, Indiana head coach, I guess. Like, I thought he had a fine first year. I think the recruiting like left a little bit to be desired. So like I don't understand that allocation of funds there either. When like if you could have taken the money you paid to Tim Walton and the money you paid to Justin Fry to give them a bump, and then they'll like, I don't know, go hire the best special teams coordinator out there and like maybe a guy who happens to have a defensive background in coaching too, that to me would have felt like a much more reasonable allocation of those resources than what has been done.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part of looking at this, because not everybody did get anything other than, standard cost of living raises, I guess we'd call them. That's 3% at Ohio State. Like Tony Alford got that. People asked why. It's like, well, there's only so much more you can give to somebody he was third in the country in terms of running backs coaches assistant pay last year. So he's already paid as one of the best in the country. How much more do you want to throw at that position? He's been pursued by pretty much every powerhouse program in the country over the last 3 years, which is how we wound up with this sort of raise in the first place, or to get to that level. It was 775,000 or so, 772,500, excuse me. There is going to be a ceiling at some point. You're not going to pay every single assistant $1 million. And like, again, what places can he reasonably go at that point? The other 128 schools are not paying the running backs coach that much money. We know he has aspirations to be a head coach, but even MAC schools are eliminated from that conversation unless you truly want to be a head coach, because he's making more money than they do. So a lot of these guys aren't going to be unhappy with that amount of money. How could you be? And so I don't know. It just look at it on paper and it's kind of staggering. And there's so many other ways that you can evaluate it. We could spend all day. We shouldn't, but trying to figure out what's the best way to put it together. I agree with you. I think what you're saying, like, I'm not sure that this is the very best way you could spend $9 million. And that's not to pick on any single one person out there. Ohio State has a staff full of really good men doing good work who their players like playing for. And that shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. That's valuable in of itself. But I think you can look at, if you had that same amount of money, are there other people who, I don't want to do this, are not 70 years old, not on the downside of their career, who weren't out of contract, and bring them back for another $1.1 million for another, and with another 1 year deal? I don't really understand the justification for that part because of the amount of money we're talking about. We're not talking about a max school and somebody making $100,000 and, on the way up in their career. We're talking about a program that is trying to win a national championship each and every year. And you're talking about 7 figures for that position coach.
Mm-hmm.
That, I have a hard time with it. And I don't fault anybody for taking the money. Same thing you said. And I'm not trying to pocket watch either, but that's like, if you're evaluating the program and how much you're spending, you should probably be getting a more notable return on it.
Yeah, I think that's the overwhelming thought for me. It's like, because you're right. I think the do the players like them? Do they fit well with the culture? Do they carry forward the head coach's messaging? That kind of stuff. Like all that is important. Like, I don't want to dismiss any of that. Are they, like, I don't know, genuinely good people and not the human pieces of garbage? and Ohio State doesn't have that going on either. These all, like you said, they all seem like stand up guys. But the results, I think, are the bigger part of it. And I don't know if they're getting that at every place they're investing at the moment. They're getting it from Brian Hartline, who's making $1.6 million this year, and I think like, I don't even want to use words like deserved, undeserved, but like, that to me is a worthwhile investment and a number that you probably have to pay to keep him on your staff. He got head coaching interviews this year. He was, I'm sure, received overtures to be an OC at other places. I do find with him, I'm curious your thought on this. The money 1.6, which is more than they were paying Kevin Wilson. Kevin Wilson made like 1.4, maybe just a bit north of that. And the term is 3 years, and but I think that goes back to last year too. So he didn't sound like a new 3-year extension, but he is under contract through the 2025 season, which is longer than these contracts typically go. Usually they're just 2-year deals. Does that tell you anything about the play calling stuff, like the investment there, that maybe this is more likely to happen with him this year than perhaps we give credit?
I don't know. Well, I guess I do know. I mean, if Miami is trying to hire Brian Hartline to be their offensive coordinator because they think that that's going to allow them to recruit South Florida better, then that's a ransom that you have to pay to keep him on your staff, as you said. But could you have done that for less for somebody who's at their alma mater? I would think there's a good chance of that. But if you're going to build that in and bake that in, that Ryan Day wants to be more hands off, you say, well, and we're going to give you some additional play calling responsibility. Then if I'm Brian Hartline's agent, I say, well, yeah, okay, well, then that means that this number is going up because Kevin Wilson didn't do that as the primary voice for the offense. So, like, we're going to thank you for the leverage and the free extra money. Like, I think that was, a lot of these guys in this situation, if you're looking at the numbers, how do they get to that point? It's because they had the stronger leverage, and Brian Hartline has that. Like, Tim Walton appeared to have that. Justin Fry, I think when you talk about him going to $1 million, I think that he had that as well, because you're not going to start over on the offensive line again. Again, I don't know that his situation is different. I'm not suggesting he was going to leave, but he could if he wanted to. So, and I think that he would have been able to get himself in the mix for head coaching jobs right now if that had been his desire at this point. So all those guys had the ability to go sit at the table and say, well, what are you going to do without me? Mm-hmm. And I think in almost every circumstance here, Ohio State would say, we'd rather not go down that road. And especially they did not want to do that with Brian Hartline. So in that circumstance specific, you give him whatever you want. And I don't think that he pressed Ryan Day into giving him the play calling duties. I think Ryan Day was trending towards that already. But that had to be part of the conversation if you're putting together contracts. That's just the way it works. You have to know what the job description is. And I'm reasonably confident that he will call the plays this season, despite whatever they go through and who calls it on Saturday and what the spring's like and all that stuff. Like, I don't think that they could have had any of those conversations in the off season and be like, you know what, well, we'll figure that out in September. I don't think so, because somebody else is going to say, come down here and be the offensive coordinator right now. We know you can do it. And then, then what?
I think that and this commitment to him pushes me more toward that thinking as well. Like I'm probably a little more skeptical, or was a little more skeptical of him taking it over this year. And who knows what taking it over looks like, right? It might be a tandem deal with him and Ryan Day this first year as Ryan, because he's never done it before. Like as sharp as Brian Hartline is, I'm sure he's not afraid to admit what he doesn't know. And I think he will need maybe not help, a little guidance in taking over this new role. But the fact too that it's like 3 years and not a 1 year extension or whatever leads me to believe too that like long term the vision is for him to be the guy to call the plays sort of in a solo capacity eventually. So, but this is it's a little more frankly than I thought they were going to give him. Like he's earned it. He's the best recruiter at his position in the country, and I tend to believe he'll be good at calling plays because he's been good at everything else he's tried. So it's interesting though, like that they ponied up that much money for him and more than like Kevin Wilson, who is has a pretty long track record of being a really good play caller in college football and a former head coach. And now Brian Hartline's making more than he was to do. I guess not the same job entirely, but same title.
I think the length of that contract also gives you some breathing room if you're Gene Smith and you think, well, maybe there's some circumstance where Ryan Day gets whatever, something happens, whether deciding to leave, that he's done dealing with NIL, don't just walks away, whatever, any circumstance, fill in the blank, whatever you think it could be. You have a 3-year window where potentially Brian Hartline would still be already on the staff, can give you continuity, could potentially take over at Ohio State. I don't know that he will or he won't, but I know that he's in a pretty strong position to do so now since he's already here. And by the fact that you pay him for that now, you have his loyalty. It's not a 1-year deal. You're not going to be facing a salary negotiation, a contract negotiation every year or every other year. You know, maybe that's part of the thinking. I don't know if it is or isn't, but I know that there's no scenario where Ohio State wanted Brian Hartline to leave and doesn't want him to leave anytime soon.
Yeah, and I really don't think he's going to. I just don't know what that opportunity would look like at this point. Unless it's like, I don't know. I guess the NFL, like we've talked about that before, the NFL does seem enticing to him. But if he's going to have play calling duties, he's making a more than comfortable salary. He's at a place that he likes, a place that has shown a commitment to him. I think they're pretty well positioned there. So they have an offensive coordinator who's making 1.6 and a defense coordinator who's making basically $2 million. Who would have thought we'd get to this point?
Somebody mentioned like looking at all those deals and how much they were making. Like, how is that all that Mark Pantoni makes? And
what was his number?
It's like just over 2, right? I'd have to pull it up again. And I would say to that question, you're right, especially now with the importance of the general manager position overseeing both recruiting and the transfer portal. He is one of the most important people, not just in the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, but for a national title contender. That makes him one of the most important people in college football. And I know that would be that's probably the next battle for Ohio State if we dig deeper into this, like paying the support staff, you know, your Quinn Temples, your Mark Pantonis, your CJ Barnetts, and then their staff underneath that, your video people, graphics people. I think that's probably the one spot where Ohio State is certainly active in it, but I know for a fact that their pay to that level people below the full-time, 10 assistants and Ryan Day is lagging a little bit behind. And there's been a lot of turnover there. Even just last year, Mark Pantoni brings in somebody Zach Grant loses him after 1 year to Cincinnati. That's not really the kind of spot that's not happening to the full-time football staff, the assistants. They're not losing those people, but that is happening at the level below that. And if you're trying to enhance that continuity, that may be a spot where that's the next place that Ohio State has to look to like up that investment. We're not talking about NIL or any other things. The people that are, professional staffers in there, that's the spot where there's probably room that has to be reached.
Yeah, they don't have like an army of analysts. They have a more robust analyst staff certainly than they had like 5 years ago. And they don't have like the Nick Saban polishing school or whatever he does down there for recently fired head coaches. But they could probably do more there. I don't know. It'd be interesting to have a conversation with Gene about like how much wiggle room there is for that, given how robust the full-time assistant salary pool is. But yeah, they could probably do more there. I'd also too, like, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, this is I don't want to confuse people. The money comes from different places, but there is a apparent like difference in mindset too with how they approach, salaried coaching positions and how they approach NIL in terms of how aggressive they want to be. And maybe that's because there's not enough money for them to be as aggressive as they want to be in the NIL space. I don't know what that is, but juxtaposed next to each other, they are kind of strikingly different in approach. I don't, unless maybe you disagree with that, but that's one other thing that I thought about when seeing these salaries.
Yeah, that's a whole nother can of worms to kick over. I think you're right. But I think we've probably reached our limit of financial
You don't want
expertise.
to talk for 40 more minutes about that?
I do, but that, we try and keep the podcast daily more manageable for your morning commutes or wherever. I don't know how everyone listens to it, but I know that they don't like hour-long versions of the podcast daily. So we won't give them one of those. We'll have more coverage coming from the Woody later on Tuesday. Ryan Day is going to speak. Again, as I mentioned, 2 practices this week and then the scrimmage on Saturday. So we'll have full coverage of that at ohiostate.rivals.com and on the podcast. The podcast daily for Wednesday, we'll have Byrne back. We'll break down everything that we heard from Ryan Day and what's next for Ohio State after spring practice number 3. But that's a wrap for this one. That's Bill. I'm Austin. Thanks for joining us on the podcast daily. Have a great Tuesday. We'll see you later.